Welcome to r/RedditRevenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story: parents took my parents' property, so I ruined their reputation. The second story: dude doesn't want to pay and shows up with goons and a bat, gets surrounded by a gangster and runs away. The third story: phone returned. Thief out $20, no cops needed. Gotham has a new superhero. The first story is: my foster parents treated me like crap, so I obliterated their reputation in our small town. My parents were both killed in a hit-and-run car accident when I was 10. My dad was only 39 and my mom 35. Neither of them had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small church-going town where everyone knew one another. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune, and so didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big city, so him and my mom decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mom was into collecting antiques. I would have had to go to the orphanage route when they died, but this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made this big to-do in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time and I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but they were something cringeworthy like that. The Banks had their own daughter, Kitty, who was a year older than me. That should have meant we would be super good friends, but Kitty had her own thing going and practically ignored me. She was the holier-than-thou type. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I was 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my inheritance. The Banks weren't exactly cruel to me, but in private it was clear they were just using me to build up their reputation in town. In front of other people, they'd fawn over me in a sick cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Kitty be nice to me in public, which she resented. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check up on me. They'd coach me before the lady would come and tell me to praise how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on crap on the internet or on trips. It was clear to me even as a tween and teen that the Banks were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest they spent on themselves. As I grew older, I could see that my foster parents would pretend as though they had great business acumen, and that's why they had more money and could buy a new Volvo. Where I'm from, a new Volvo is an event, and take a trip to New York and buy fancy clothes for Kitty. When I was 17, I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling away my trust fund money to pay for Kitty's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the Banks would never outright say so, but would heavily imply that I owed them, and that once I got control of my inheritance, that I should be godly and generous and give them some material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already got lots of material, especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mom's antiques from her store and kept them for herself, gave them to Kitty or to her other relatives. One thing my mom never kept at her store was an extremely expensive Baroque-era fine china set, absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. Not a replica, but the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might well have eaten a steak off those plates. Probably not, but you get the point. It was my china set, of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how this china set will go to Kitty on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that since I always dressed like a tomboy, didn't care about all my mom's antiques that Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, that I just didn't care about the china set. When I was a kid, my mom told me that things were things, and not to obsess over them. So having the frou-frou china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away. Wrong, lady. So once Kitty went off to college, thanks to my biological mom and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I'd always done well in school, and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. The rest I could easily pay for with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. Per usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were haranguing me about how I owed them compensation, and since I was going to be rich soon, I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years, they probably stole or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused. I think they more than shared the wealth. I never promised anything. I just smiled and kept a tally of every single bank statement. I got them quarterly, that my trust issued over the years. The Banks family never shared them with me, of course, but when I asked the actual bank for a rundown, they were more than happy to oblige. I also wrote down every single major purchase my foster parents clearly made over the past 7 years, with money that was clearly beyond their means as a housewife and an insurance salesman. Things such as a $40,000 car for cash, a used $20,000 car for cash that they gave to Kitty, trips to Hawaii, New York, cash gifts to the church that made them look super generous at my deceased parents' expense. I kept it all in a nice 3-ring binder. I already arranged my travel to my new campus. I didn't have much stuff at the Banks' house anyway, and had zero intention of coming back, at least to their home. The Banks knew I was leaving but didn't bother seeing me off, because they assumed I'd come back to give them their due. I waited for our church's yearly antique sale extravaganza set to begin in 3 days. Per usual, the Banks donated all sorts of random stuff, many of it knickknacks that used to belong to my mom and technically belonged to me. They weren't shy about giving away my stuff and taking credit for it. While Mr. and Mrs. Banks were on one of their shopping sprees with my parents' money and away from their house, I boxed up the china set and brought it to church. I told the rummage sale committee that Mrs. Banks wanted to donate the priceless antiques for sale, all benefits to go to the church. This donation is made in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks. I was being fair. If Mrs. Banks was really so godly, she would be delighted that such a wonderful donation be made in her name. Sadly, I knew she'd go the other way, because she was faker than porn star implants. The ladies were flabbergasted, especially when I told them the appraisal of the set's value. I also told them if they needed proof of ownership and right to sell, to contact the number of a certain attorney in New York. They thanked me profusely and praised the Lord Jesus for Mrs. Banks' generosity. This would be the most expensive item in their sales history. Everyone knew no one could afford to buy the set outright, but everyone would love to buy the pieces piecemeal. Like I got a cup and saucer, or I got one of the chargers. I got an egg cup. The Banks were supposed to work the sale the second day and I wasn't there. What I did hear was that my foster mom went ballistic when she saw her china set for sale, and that it was a huge hit, and ladies from all over the country had bought pieces of it, and it raised so much money for the church. My foster mom threw a tantrum and said that I had stolen the set from her house. The ladies at the church explained that I had made the donation in her name, and she was getting credit for the donation of the church. My foster mom was practically yanking her hair out, according to what I heard later. She was trying to track down who had brought pieces, and trying to get them back. Of course, she was unsuccessful. What she was successful in was looking like a grade A D-bag. The entire church thought she was selfish and materialistic and acting very ungodly, especially the way she cursed her foster daughter. A week later, my foster parents received a package by registered mail from me and my attorney. It contained my binder where I showed my bank statements, and also a list of all their spending extravagances. It also contained a warning from my attorney that should they ever try to contact me again for money, that they'll receive a bill and a court date. That was that. 10 years later, I work as a 3rd grade teacher. I'm married to an accountant, and we have a 3-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. Kitty ended up working through college, and as we've gotten older, we've reconnected. She apologized for the way she acted when we were kids. We're friends now, and see each other multiple times a year, often just for lunch. She's an elementary school teacher, too, and married to an engineer. She has a 4-year-old daughter. Both of our older kids play together when our families meet. We both have our own wedding china. She's gone to a lot of therapy due to her toxic parents, she tells me. As for her parents, they still live in their small town because they're too broke to move. Their reputation is being that couple who drove both their children away and stole money from that poor little girl whose parents died, and they tried to steal money from Jesus when they whined about getting their Baroque china back. I hope your Volvo was worth it, a-holes. The next story is, don't mess with my dad. The events in the story occurred a few years ago. I was present and witnessed a part of it. So my dad's a mechanic and runs his own repair shop. He has quite the reputation within our community, as literally everyone knows him, as he was the go-to mechanic in the area. The morning was, as usual, a huge influx of customers dropping off their cars before they go to work. After the morning rush, it would be lunch for the workers, which is when the story starts. A particular customer, let's call him DB, came in during lunch break and asked for his car to be fully serviced. He dropped off his keys and went on his way. So far, nothing unusual. The next day during noon, DB returned and my dad hands him the bill. DB takes a glance at the bill, refused to pay, and demands for the keys. Obviously, my dad refuses, as he already worked on the car and replaced a number of parts. What followed was some verbal abuse and threats made against my dad before DB leaving the premises. The day after, I happened to be in my dad's shop in the afternoon. DB approached with 4 other dudes and a baseball bat. The moment my dad saw them, he locked the door and told me to stay inside. He picked up the phone and made a single call. At first, I thought he called the police, but within a minute, 20 or so men from the billiard place next door stepped out and surrounded DB and his goons. These 20 men had the look of gangsters with singlets, tattoos, scars across the faces, gold teeth, etc. My dad stepped out and told DB and his goons to peeve off or else, which DB, while scared SH-less, complied and ran away. The 20 or so men went back to the billiard place and my dad thanked them. He then went back to the office and told me, "It's good to have connections." Apparently my dad was friends with the owner of the billiard place and most of the 20 men. Now for the aftermath. DB's mother called my dad and asked him why he didn't give her son's car back. My dad told her about DB showing up with his goons in a bat. DB's mother understood and said that DB is an adult and should resolve this mess himself. Obviously, my dad got no word from DB, and after several months of holding DB's car, he did the proper paperwork to take ownership of the car and sell it as it was taking up too much space. Made a cool $10K. The last story is Scam Artist versus Sandwich Artist. I worked at Subway about 12 years ago. My coworker and I were closing up for the night, and some guy came to the door with a proposition. He offered to leave his cell phone in exchange for $40 to do whatever he needed to do. Once he was done, he'd return in less than an hour and give us our money back, plus an extra $20. We were young and stupid and we fell for it. This was the best night we'd ever seen for tips, $24 each, so he felt like we had nothing to lose. He left us his stolen cell phone, took our money, and never came back. We looked up home in the contacts list of the phone, called it, and were greeted by a very angry owner, demanding to know who we were and why we had his phone. We explained the situation and told him to pick it up at our store the next day. My coworker and I happened to have split shifts the next day, so one of us would be there no matter when the owner showed up. He came early in the morning, and coworker informed me about the pickup when I came in. About an hour after my shift started, a car backed up to the front of the store, out of sight of the window, and almost in the street that ran past. This seemed odd, since there was no one else parked in front. A scraggly-looking gentleman, not the guy from the night before, entered and told the other guy working with me that he left his phone here yesterday and was told he could retrieve it. I said, "Oh right, other guy, go find it in the back. I have to run outside." As I was taking the license plate down, I noticed the driver was watching me. It was the phone thief himself. I chuckled as I walked up to his window and said he could have the phone back, but first I get my money back. He pulls $40 out of his wallet, which I took, and then demanded the extra $20 he promised. He refused at first, but then I reminded him that I've got his plate number, and now his buddy's on camera asking for obviously stolen property. He gently handed me the extra cash by crumbling in his fist and throwing at me, so I smiled and told him his buddy will be back out soon. Back inside the store, my coworker reports that he can't find the police anywhere. I said the phone was picked up this morning by the real owner and I'm calling the police. Scraggles ran out, jumped in the car, and they peeled off. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.